So by the time we get to historical times, so, Europeans have had an impact, diseases, they reduced the population in the 1630s in this area by 2/3. We talk about COVID. COVID mortality rate's about 1-2% max. It's still bad if you know someone who's died of COVID. Oh my goodness, right? It's awful. It's a pandemic. And this, in the 1630s, they were hit with smallpox and measles and all kinds of European diseases they'd never experienced, one after the other. So if you survive smallpox, you have a weakened immune system, and then along comes the flu, and it kills you, right? And so 2/3 of them died. We know this from census records. We see it in burials, right? Mass graves dating to the 1630s, 40s. 2/3 of the people died. Imagine the shock. Imagine, in a period of 5 years, think of your own extended family. 5 years from now, there's only going to be 1/3 alive. And we're talking children gone, old ones gone, people your age gone, young ones gone. It was indiscriminate in terms of who it killed. The diseases just killed people, right? So, grief-stricken, right? It was something unprecedented. The world hasn't seen that kind of mortality rate from disease. Really hadn't. Maybe in the very first smallpox epidemic, unrecorded in Europe, back, say, 2,000-3,000 years ago, maybe, you'd see that, but no, it'd be unprecedented, right? So, huge impact. So, in terms of the resilience of Indigenous peoples, right, it's amazing that they're still here, and their cultures and their languages. They're trying to keep them alive. They're the best they can, right? But it's amazing that resiliency of Indigenous culture, Indigenous communities, given that history, right? Given that history. And we all know about residential schools, right? The time of Davisville, which was occupied 1820s, Mississauga Mohawk community. I told you Methodist Christian community. Just after that, in 1830, that was the opening of the Mohawk Residential School in Brantford, right? And then residential schools became a big thing in the 1880s under the government of John A. Macdonald, right? And so that's, that truth and reconciliation, right? And of course the churches were part of that. They thought they were doing the right thing. They really thought they were doing the right thing. And in fact, some of the early advocates for the residential schools was at Davisville, and these aren't pictures of Davisville, but I'm using them as proxies for what life would have been like at Davisville. The Mohawks living in cabins, the Mississaugas living in tent structures, right? Peter Jones, who was a Methodist preacher, but Mississauga. He was part Mississauga, part Welsh from his dad, Augustus Jones, who was a land surveyor. So we have to remember that the origins of it were, they were trying, the Indigenous leaders at that time in the early 19th century were trying to do the best they could and navigate their way into the future that they could see coming. Their old way of life was not possible any longer, right? With the settlement and the carving up of the land and everything else. So it's like, how do we remain Indigenous in this new world, right? And that was what they thought of, right? But as I said, it got taken off in a whole other direction that was horrible. So the Grand River, it was Mississaugas. This is a map from 1813. You can see Mississauga Village next to an Onondaga village and a Delaware village on the top, and then, of course, Europeans living on the Lower Grand in the early 1800s. In the 1820s, a surveyor went through and did a map of all the communities of the Lower Grand. You can see up here, Kitchener-Waterloo, nobody's living up there. There weren't any, in the 1820s, there weren't any permanent cabins or settlements up this way of Mississaugas or Six Nations people. But that being the case, were there Mississauga people active in Kitchener-Waterloo? Yes, we know that from historical records. We know it from records of interactions between the Mennonites and the Mississaugas in the early 1800s, right? And in fact, it was probably Mississaugas who showed the Mennonites where to come. When they first were thinking of settling Kitchener-Waterloo area, it was probably Mississaugas who said, okay, we'll show you, because this was their hunting area, and they also had gardens in this area. We know that from historical records, right? And so the Mennonites just plopped down, used the trail system that the Mississaugas had carved out. They also overlapped old areas too, where Indigenous peoples were living historically when they came and repopulated the Grand River in the early 19th century, or late 18th century, they simply plopped themselves down on top of Princess Point sites. This whole field is covered, it's in the Brantford area, southern Brantford. This whole field is covered by Princess Point artifacts, so artifacts that are 1,500 years old. And then it's covered in artifacts dating to the 1830s of a village site that was there, Cayuga village site, on the same place, plopped down on the same place. Why? Because this is still to this day an ideal fishing ground. It's river flats. It's great for agriculture. It's floodplain now. It's only used for farming. You can't build houses on it. But still, it's very rich land for farming. There's a river there for transportation. There's cold water streams for your water. There's wetland areas for medicinal plants. There's a whole host of reasons why they live on the same areas that their ancient ancestors did. Gives you a view of the number of artifacts. And each of these flags is marking not one, but clusters of 5, 6 artifacts. If we were marking every artifact out there, you wouldn't see any green of the corn, the newly sprouted corn. It'd just be red with little forestry flags. Again, this is another site on the Lower Grand, and what I've done here, this whole field is covered in artifacts that date all the way back to Archaic times, 9,000 years ago. This whole field, and 9,000, 8,000, 7,000, 6,000, 500 years ago. And then you've got these cabins here that are Delaware cabins, plopped on the same place. This is a cold water stream, still runs today, cold water stream. So that's your water supply. There's your floodplain, agriculture across the river. Ideal fishing location. In fact, when we were out here, there were this is Six Nations of the Grand River, this property right here, in this aerial shot. There were 2 Six Nations guys fishing, had their fishing, and they were looking at us across the river, probably wondering, what the heck are they doing over there, right? Marking those field with all these little flags, right? It was strange, right? We didn't kind of shout and go, we're archaeologists! We know what you're doing, you're fishing, right? We didn't do that, right? It was kind of strange. So these are the villages that are plopped on top of one another. And as I said, the fields were carved out on one side of the village, and they kept the forest close. Emily Damstra's reconstructed, you'd carve a field out of the forest, you'd burn it, it would add nutrients to the soil, and then you'd farm it, and then let it grow up into forest again. And you'd carve out another field somewhere else, further away from the village. Eventually, you're carving fields out of the village 2 kilometers away. The women who did the bulk of the agricultural work, we know that, even in historical times. They did it as teams of related women. Remember the longhouses? They're all related women. All the women in one house, let's go everyone. We're going out to weed the maize fields, right? Take the kids with you, and right? Be a whole, kind of like the Mennonites, right? You know how the Mennonites do that? Someone barn burns down. I've seen those pictures. I haven't seen it in person, but apparently it's pretty amazing, right? If you have. And they get together as a community and they do it, right? But eventually the fields grow back again, and then it regenerates. So it's a cycle. Remember I told you about them keeping their population? All throughout the 13,000 years at a certain level. It's sustainable. The way they lived in their villages were sustainable. The only things we find are pottery and stone tools and bits of bone on the surface of a site like the Ball site that was, 8+ acres in size, Dean, held probably 1,200 people, maybe more, 1,500 maybe even. But when you go out there today, you'll just see a farmer's field. And if you don't have archaeological eyes, you wouldn't see anything. Talk about sustainable. Like 1,000 years from now is Kitchener-Waterloo. Let's say we got rid of all the people. I don't want to do that. Let's say we did. I think Kitchener-Waterloo would still kind of be here. They'd be all overgrown. There'd be trees growing out of the middle of King Street and stuff like that, right? But it'd be here, kind of. The foundations anyway, right? We're not as sustainable at all, right? But, here they deliberately. And then they would move their villages every 30 years to let the whole thing grow up into forest again, to regenerate. And they never lived on the same village site again, other than hundreds of years or thousands of years, what I talked about, right? Long after the forest had regenerated to the point where you wouldn't even know somebody had lived there before. You tell me where Six Nations is in this Google Earth. Where is it? So I'll move my finger, you tell me when to stop. It's right here. That's Six Nations of the Grand River. It's forested to this day. They're keeping the forest close to this day. They deliberately do that. It was never completely, when they settled there in the early 1800s, when they were put there, put it that way, by the government of Upper Canada in the 1840s, they deliberately kept forests close to them. And you can still see it today in the landscape of southwestern Ontario. They're still living that Indigenous cultural landscape, is what I'm telling you today. White oak savanna. It was a big part of this area, of this landscape, all the way up to not quite Kitchener-Waterloo, but North Dumfries was oak savanna. You don't see it anymore. It's been the oak trees have been cut down, but oak savanna is a maintained, manufactured landscape, a cultural landscape of Indigenous peoples that's thousands of years old. And this has come out through forestry studies, mostly in the United States. But a high correlation between where Indigenous archaeological sites are, especially agricultural sites, and oak savanna. Oak savanna was created by burning. So every few years you burn the undergrowth under the oak trees. Oak trees, the bark's really thick. They're really resilient to burning. It's really difficult to burn an oak forest down. It really is. They're resistant to fire, oak trees. So by burning the understory, you're keeping it open, and you just have these oak trees with lots of acorns and browse for deer. And so it was their hunting areas, right? And this is a forest being burned here, right? Just to show you. So oak savanna maintained landscapes. But again, once Indigenous people were taken off the land was carved up and sold to Mennonites and other people. They could no longer use those areas. They could no longer burn them. They were being cut down and used for farm fields or for, livestock, pastures. So that, again, their whole landscape. This is in the Brantford area, just to give you an idea of oak savannas. It's a historical atlas map. So here's downtown Brantford, right? And these dots are Six Nations sites dating to the early 1800s. So you can see they're keeping the oak savannas. This survey took place in the 1820s. And they recorded all these oak savannas. Before the land was carved up the way you see it on this historical atlas of the 1870s and sold as farmland, right? But once upon a time, that was the landscape of Brant County. Well, William Pope, a naturalist, he recorded why they did that. And it's very clear here from what he's saying that, it was the grass might more freely grow, which furnished plenty of food for the deer, right? That's why they kept the oak savannas. And you have to burn them every few years. Natural forest fires in this area occur every 200 years. Not going to be enough to maintain oak savanna. Oak savanna is maintained by human hands. And we know from Eric Tincombe's information about where archaic sites are, they match where the oak savannas are as well for deer hunting areas. So they're thousands of years old. They're thousands of years old. Fishing. Fishing is really important too, especially sturgeon. We see sturgeon on sites, not a lot, but we see sturgeon on sites right up until about 1840 on Indigenous sites. Then they stop. Why? Because they put dams in, and it prevented sturgeon from swimming up from Lake Erie to spawn in the Grand River. A good friend of mine, Paul General, retired, works with Six Nations of the Grand River, wildlife officer. His dream is to blow all the dams up along the Grand to allow sturgeon to spawn the way they used to. Fishery was so productive at Davisville in the 1820s, Peter Jones records, in one night of jacklight fishing, they caught 120 fish in the Brantford area. In one night, 120 fish. Try to do that today. Good luck to you. They still fish. I know people who spearfish. This is an archival photo of 100 years or so ago, but I know people, young people I've worked on archaeological sites with, who still spearfish. It's illegal for you and I to spearfish. We can't do that. Ministry of Natural Resources would be fining you big time, right? But they're permitted to do it because that's what their ancestors have done. And I asked a guy, Wayne Hill, a guy I worked with, and he would go all the way down to the eastern end of Lake Ontario, Prince Edward County, to spearfish in Trent River area. And I said, Wayne, why Why do you do that? He goes, Gary, I just have to. That was his answer. I just have to. Okay, good enough answer. What he was saying to me is, culturally, it's just in me. I have to. This is part of who I am. It's part of who I am. That was his answer. Kind of neat. Maple sugar camps, right? They were out there in a big way. They're gone now for the most part, right? Where indigenous peoples would have had them, right? This is my attempt to reconstruct for the Attawandaron. These villages, these circles are villages of different ages. So 1350 AD, 1400, 1450. The yellow circles are 1500-ish, right? So it gives you an idea as to where villages in their field, the radius around their fields is about 2 kilometers, right? So it gives you an idea over time of how the Kitchener-Waterloo area would have looked. There were about 2,000 people moving every 30 years to a new village site. So, they might live here and then move to this one. And this one moves to this one, right? And, and we don't have them all. There's more circles that need to be put on here. Like, we don't know this area here because it's built up. No archaeologists had the opportunity to look at this area, right? We only know this area because it's being developed now. It's Fisher-Holman out here, right? Kitchener-Waterloo's growing onto farmland. It shouldn't be, but that's a whole other topic, right? But that's what's happening. And so, of course, these sites are being found as that urban expansion happens, right? And excavated, sadly. And I'm sad, like indigenous peoples are sad to see that part of their heritage landscape taken out, removed, because it's in the ground. It's still a visible marker. They can go and say, okay, you want to see where my ancestors lived? Let's walk into this field and look at this pottery strewn all on the field. This was a village site. They can't do that when it's removed, can they? They can't do it. And so it becomes forgotten that their ancestors ever lived there. It's a form of erasure. It erases. It's like on the chalkboard. It's like, okay, let's just excavate this side, gone, before you know it, right? It'd be hard to draw this landscape, wouldn't it? If all the sites were gone, we didn't have any left in Kitchener-Waterloo. If the urbanization happened before there was such a thing as an archaeologist, right? I wouldn't be able to do this now. We just wouldn't know. We wouldn't know. There would be no physical evidence, put it that way. There'd be oral stories from the indigenous communities, but this is a blow-up of that. These lines here are trails. Trails that became early roads used by the Mennonites, but these trails, again, are probably hundreds of years old because they connect village sites that were no longer there in the 1800s when the Mennonites arrived. But the trails were used over and over again. And we know this because on the northwest coast, there's trails that go through the forests of British Columbia, connecting village sites on the northwest coast that are 9,000 years old. And I've seen photographs of them. They're indents in the forest floor. Like, it's almost like, if the forest floor is here, you're walking on a trail that's like, knee level deep into the forest because feet have just kept that path going. It's crazy. I'm not saying that was the case here, but maybe, right? Trails, as long as there's people using them, and they get, yourself, right? You going somewhere, if you could cross you're not going to go the longest route, are you? You're going to cut across, go, oh, okay, can I cut across here? And other people are going to use the same thing. They're not going to walk through the tall grass and get all wet. They're going to use that trail, right? We do it. That's humans, right? We've done it for hundreds of thousands of years, right? That way. So this is Oak Savannah, showing you larger village site here, village site here. And that's interesting because this village site is on the Oak Savannah. You think, why would they put a village site in their cornfields on areas where they're hunting deer? Well, they weren't. This old village site in the fields were probably incorporated and expanded into an Oak Savannah that was used later by a village site here. This is an earlier one, right? So this Oak Savannah was recorded in the early 1800s by surveyors, land surveyors. So what I'm telling you is, this Oak Savannah has been expanded after the life of this village. Once it was abandoned in 1350, they simply maintained the old cornfields going, well, there's an oak tree here, an oak tree there, because they didn't just clear the land for their maize fields. They didn't cut down every single tree. They didn't. They would leave some trees for shade trees, right? And maybe even oaks for acorns and things like that, right? So it'd be pretty simple to convert an old maize field into oak savanna. Pretty simple, just by selective burning. This is an overlay map just showing you, it doesn't show up very well, but I tried to overlay the Mennonite settlement, which is this whiter area. This is all uncleared forest here. But you can see these village sites are still sitting in the forest, and the Mennonites cleared this area in here, down by the river. They were living more by the river, right? But we don't have any record, sadly. Were they on old Attawandaron village sites, some of their farms? We don't know that. We don't know. There's not any records. Sarah Hunt, who's Indigenous woman from the Northwest Coast, called that erasing a colonial scape, right? So what we live in in Kitchener-Waterloo is a colonial scape. I mean, that's her term she's used, right? It's brilliant, really, right? And it's basically she's saying, you can read her words, we call this space Canada, but from an Indigenous point of view, they're still using the land in a traditional way as best they can. The oak savannas are gone, their maple sugaring camps are gone, they're spearfishing where they can, on their own small little postage stamp reserve. They still burn. They burn fields, I've been told that. Periodically they burn their fields to regenerate the growth, to get rid of the weeds, right? It's something that you won't see farmers doing around here. They're not burning their fields, right? The stubble, right? At least I've never seen it. Maybe you know of somebody who does that, but I've never seen it, right? You just plow it under, right? You don't burn it. The rationale is, started in 1821, right? And this was kind of the beginning of, the residential schools. And to be honest, I said, that poor Egerton Ryerson and Peter Jones are kind of, historically labeled as, people who started residential school ideas, but in a racist kind of way, it was people like Maitland who had the idea for taking all the people and putting the kids in schools, in boarding schools, right? But he also had the idea of getting them off the land too. And how do you do that? Well, he said back to London, well, they're no longer useful as hunting ground, right? But I know from Davisville, 1821, Davisville was occupied in the 1820s. 95% of the animal bone we're getting is wild game in northwestern Brantford. So it's like, he's saying they're not hunting anymore. But as an archaeologist, I know they were. You're lying. Why do you think he's lying? Because he wants to open up the land for British settlement, right? Who's going to check? Is someone from London going to take a sailing boat and go, I don't know, Peregrine, I ain't going to check myself. No, they just accepted what these guys were reporting back to London, right? So it'd be pretty easy to lie. We know now, you were lying, but look, it doesn't matter now. It's too late. We weren't doing archaeology in 1821, right? It's too late now. But we know that things like this were a lie, So you take, this landscape, and, that's what happened, right, in Brantford, all over southern Ontario, right? And you do this to it, right? That's the colonial scape that Sarah Hunt's talking about. And we commemorate, right? You've all seen that tower. I was there, I took this picture, I don't know, like a month ago I was there. I'd never seen it, believe it or not. Living in Brantford, I've never gone up to see the tower. I was there all by myself, right? One day, and it was a nice, bright, sunny day. You could see the moon still. See the moon? One of those mornings, right? And I thought, this is strange. And there's a cemetery there, right? Is it the Shirk Cemetery? Those of you who know that area? Anyway, family cemetery, right? It was like, whoa, this is different, right? So that indigenous landscape, where is it? It's not in the historical atlases. It's not in the present day landscape, and it's not in the things we call historic sites or national historic sites, right? We commemorate, it's the settler heritage landscape that we honor, right? And we like to think, it's an inconvenient truth, to use Senator Gore's So at Six Nations, people were settled down on the postage stamp that they live on now, which is, quite a small little area. And they're away from the river, too. They're no longer on the river. They're on lots and concessions, in small little cabins. And then, of course, the rest of the land was taken up. Now, Joseph Brant did sell some of the land. I've been told by people at Six Nations that people starved to death because of Joseph Brant selling the land and filling his own pockets. Joseph Brant is not well liked at Six Nations, not by traditional people at any rate. And yet, Brantford erected a statue to Joseph Brant in Victoria Park, in downtown Brantford. Scratch your head on that one, right? Why are we commemorating Joseph Brant in Brantford when he's not well liked at Six Nations itself, right? So, and again, how do we honor that Indigenous past, that Indigenous history, right? Sarah Hunt goes on to say, although the land was imagined as empty, made to be legally empty, we know through Indigenous people's lived experiences, oral histories, and legal relations, and I would say, and archaeology, that the land was not empty. It was indeed rich with life that goes back to time immemorial, not back to the date of Canada's formation. So Carolyn King at Mississaugas of the Credit has an idea to commemorate where archaeological sites were, and even oral history, where her people, the Mississaugas, where they were in the Grand River watershed, by putting moccasins. She has a stencil, and you just spray paint on sidewalk or on a parking lot or maybe even on a building. I don't know. She's never proposed that, but she has a website. I invite you to go visit it, right? It's called the Moccasin Identifier Project. And that's her idea of saying, remind non-Indigenous Canadians, hey, there's an Indigenous landscape that was here and still could be here if we were allowed to continue the activities that made that landscape in the past. And lastly, I just want to end here, and I've talked way too long. You guys have been very, very attentive. Paul General, my good friend Paul General at Six Nations. I met him actually in Kitchener, probably in the year 2000. Yeah, in the fall, no, the winter. It would have been the winter of 2000 in February. That Heritage Day, they have the Heritage Day, they still have it. Although with COVID, I don't think they've run it for the last couple of years. Anyway, it was at, I think it was in the Walper Hotel, have I got that right, in Kitchener? I think that's where they held it. There was like a room, right? And I didn't know Paul. I was new. I was the new kid on the block. I'd just been hired by Laurier Brantford in 1999. I came from Toronto. I lived in Toronto, right? I grew up in Hamilton, so I wasn't familiar with the Grand River. Six Nations I knew a little bit, but so that was my introduction to Paul General. We got talking at lunch, and it's like, oh, Gary, yeah, you're at Laurier Brantford. Yeah, who are you? Oh, I'm the wildlife officer for Six Nations. Oh, yeah, I enjoyed your presentation. And eventually we developed this friendship, right? Still are fast friends. He's retired now, and I'm retired. But we were at lunch, 15 years ago or so, on Six Nations of the Grand River in one of the little local cafes. And corn soup, I really like corn soup. I don't know if you've ever had traditional corn soup from Six, and if you haven't, go down to Six Nations of the Grand River and go in any restaurant. At lunch, they'll serve corn soup, right? It can be an acquired taste depending on how well it's made. But anyway, every so often, I really need a bowl of corn soup. So there we were eating our corn soup, and we got talking about land, I guess, and the farms, and my work at Davisville that I was doing at that time, the archaeology. And I said, Paul, it must be really frustrating, as an Indigenous person to look out on the landscape and know that your ancestors had all of this at one time, and now you're confined to the reserve, and you have to ask permission to do this, that, and the other thing. I said, what about hunting right in the local area? And he said, well, I'll tell you a story. He goes, a couple of years ago, he goes, I got a call from this irate farmer in Brant County who said, some of your guys, he was phoning Paul General, some of your guys are hunting on my farm, and I want you to do something about it, right? And he started, getting more and more angry and kind of yelling four-letter words at Paul over the phone. Paul's he's got that very Six Nations demeanor, tried to keep calm, and he said he just became a little bit desperate, and this guy, he was getting nowhere with this farmer, and he acknowledged, he said, yeah, did they get permission, did they knock on your door? No, they didn't. He goes, well, they should have. He acknowledged that to the farmer, yeah, I'll let them know, right? I know who it is. I'll let them know that they should be knocking at your door. But he said, the bottom line here is they're not hunting on your farm. Your farm's on their hunting territory. And then, of course, the farmer angrily just slammed the phone down, right? But when Paul told me this story, it was a classic. It was like, it totally inverted what I've just been talking about. That colonial scape, it put the indigenous landscape on top of the colonial scape, right? It's one of those stories that you hear and right away you go, bing! Yeah. Like how do we do that? How do we get Paul's story out there so that we all begin to think a little bit more about, what I'm doing or this development, is it honoring that indigenous cultural landscape, or is it preventing them from doing activities they've done for thousands of years, or is it destroying that archaeological site forever and removing it? Does it really have to be done? Can a portion just be excavated and save another portion and put interpretive plaques out there with paintings on? Or one thing I heard recently, I was at a conference, and a colleague of mine said that a new subdivision, and I forget where it was, but all the owners were provided with a little DVD, the homeowners, the new homeowners, because there was a big village site that had been excavated on their subdivision. Not necessarily their house, right, but probably. And they were all given a little DVD where they'd done drone work, and they'd done it before the development ever happened, so you got forest and farm fields. Then they did it while the archaeologists were excavating, showing the longhouses, and it was like a time-lapse kind of video. And then today, the subdivision, right? And I thought, that is such a cool thing. That's such a cool thing to remind people of where their house is. That, you could be sitting on Longhouse number 6 in this 1400 AD village. There's your house. Wouldn't that be cool to actually know that, right? And how would you treat your backyard and your gardens and everything else? Probably a little bit differently, maybe. Maybe you'd put up more bird feeders to try to honor, right? Somehow. Try to preserve as much you could in that urban landscape. It's tough. But anyway, there's lots of things that could be done that we don't do enough of, right? We really don't do enough of that to bring back, to invert, the way Paul General did with that farmer, to invert and bring back the indigenous cultural landscape and the ideas behind it too, that sustainability that we all are starving for right now. We all recognize, whoa, this climate change, it's an emergency. What are we all going to do? We all feel kind of helpless right now. We don't talk about it, do we? It's like those real unpleasant things that we don't like to talk about, right? Climate change is one of those, right? But we do need to talk about it more, but we also need solutions. Otherwise, you're just hopeless. It's like, it's hopeless, right? I'm just going to party till I go, right? You could develop that attitude, and some people do. I'm just going to party hardy till I go, right? I don't care. But there is hope. I'm a optimistic person, right? Glasses half full. There's hope, right? But what things do we need? And I would say stuff from indigenous communities, their culture, the teachings, the landscapes, right, of the past. That can be kind of a model for us, right? Not saying that can you have Kitchener Waterloo? Can all of us live the way people did in a longhouse village? No, and that's impossible today. But if we started to think a bit more about our great-grandchildren, their faces are in the earth, right? I think just those concepts from indigenous culture, indigenous knowledge, right? If we incorporate those more into our school system, the kids take it in who are not indigenous, right? It's, that's how things will change. I'm convinced of that, but we're not there yet, right? We're not there yet. But it's things I'm presenting, what I've learned as an archaeologist and talking with the living community over the last 20 to 25 years, but I didn't know any of this. As a young archaeologist, right? Dean, probably not the same, right? We weren't trained that way. We weren't trained to look at the land that way. And we didn't see it until, you're reminded of this. It's like, oh yeah, this farm was not a farm forever. The farm was on top of something else, right? That was here before, used by people who are still here. It's not like they're extinct and gone. They're still here, right? And that's important for all of us in this time of reconciliation and in the spirit of reconciliation that we acknowledge that and honor that, right? And that's what Indigenous peoples want, that's what they would like, for us to honor that, right? They want to live side by each with us. They don't want us to all get on boats and go back from where we came from. They don't want that. I've never heard a single Indigenous person say that. And you won't, right? Because it was done to them. And they wouldn't do that to you. They just wouldn't. And that's what's said to me when I've asked, how come you don't just, hate non-Indigenous people for what they've done over the years, right? And it's like, no, Gary, that's not part of our culture, right? And we would never wish that on people, to get on a boat and go wherever, right? It'd be a refugee. We would never do that, right? Because that's, again, not part of our culture. But what they do ask is that, we understand that history, we honor it, and we learn to live in a way that's, like their two-row wampum. If you know that two-row wampum, right, that they have. And they always remind people at every talk I've seen of an elder, right, they'll bring that two-row wampum, either a recreation of the belt or an image of it, and say, here's the canoe, here's the boat, we're on this river of life together. We need to keep the river healthy for both of us. That's the whole point. That's what they would say. We need to keep the river healthy. Don't you interfere with us. We won't interfere with you, but we need both of us to work on keeping the river healthy. Right? So I'll end there. Thanks for being attentive.
Well, Gary, Warrick, and Dean, you're a real part of this. We can see as you go along. I really want to thank you deeply. This, I just thought it was great, and I was learning a lot, and it was so integrated and enthusiastic. You obviously live it and care about peoples, have done your homework, so we get the facts and background, and then you're integrating it with the historical and the stories. I'm wondering, as we thank you, if there's popular literature. See, I couldn't go into the archaeological as you've tread the way, but I'd sure love to see pictures and this archaeological integration. And I'm only sorry that I didn't bring at least the room full of people. So, and maybe again we have it a time when we can really publicize it and so on. But we really appreciate your taking the time and the energy and such clear pictures. It's just great today. Thank you.
Okay,
thank you.